So those of you who, like myself, work on different viruses may have the same observation that one really fun thing about working on HIV is the presence and involvement of an incredibly motivated and sophisticated advocacy community. We've spent a lot of time in Seattle working with our community advisory board, educating them about what we're doing and what the scientists think about this and the problem and what we're hoping to achieve. But it's not a one-way communication street. And in fact, part of what's so much fun is learning and listening from the community and what are people looking for in CURE and what are people looking for as we design ethical and effective trials. And so we thought we'd try to recreate that just a little bit here in this meeting by making sure this isn't a one-way street and we're just speaking and educating and providing slides for community, but we'd actually take a little bit of time and listen. And so we have the next two speakers to conclude the day will sort of be coming from a little bit more community side, working with community or being part of that themselves. So with that, I want to introduce our first speaker, Jessica Handibode, who is a program coordinator for the AIDS Vaccine Advocacy Coalition.
Great. So thank you, everyone, and especially thank you, Hans-Peter and Keith. So I saw everybody else do this, but while I sort of figure out how do I move this slide? Yep, this top one. I just want to say I work in an advocacy organization, so I work with community and part of the community, but I myself am HIV negative. I am very interested in this work and CURE in particular, and so we're going to think about really how do we engage a broad set. So something we haven't seen today, which I know all of you are aware of, but it's sort of important to put it into perspective, is just really thinking about the global burden. And 55% of the current trials that are enrolling are happening here in the U.S. with the smallest burden. So when we think about engagement, it's important that we think about who we're engaging, which is the global audience. It's also important to keep in mind somebody who is living with HIV gets an HIV positive diagnosis, but that's certainly not the only thing that they're thinking about. And why this is important to research is because if you are trying to deal with treatment access, potentially discrimination, criminalization, participating in a research study may or may not be the most important thing on your mind. You also might be dealing with things like housing security, transportation issues, job security. So the fact that you're living with HIV, especially if you're living on one pill a day, participating in research may not be the biggest concern that you have. So it's important to think about the context that community is in. So why stakeholder engagement? So it's not only the ethical thing to do, it also makes research better. So when we talk about stakeholder engagement, I'm going to talk a little bit about what that means and who it is that we're talking about. But the most important thing to think about is that stakeholders have a power to impact the course of research. And we see this on a positive side. If we look at HIV prevention, some recent trials that have gone on FAC 001 for tenofovir gel that took place with Wits Research Institute in South Africa, they actually used support groups for women to really talk through what their challenges were and really went out and engaged with the community, and they did see 60% adherence, which is different than what we saw in voice. So we do see some positive outcomes. There was also lessons from HIV prevention that we do see that tend to be negative. This trial is the early phase PrEP trials that took place in Cambodia and Cameroon that were actually shut down. They were with female sex workers, and they were closed prematurely because the advocacy organizations for female sex workers thought that this trial was exploitation. And it's important to know that this trial went through the normal or standard process. It did have a community advisory board. It did go through IRB approval. So, and these were in 2004, 2005, and it's at this point that we see that there might be something missing in an engagement plan. It's not just enough to consult a CAB or an IRB, but there might be something more that you have to do. And so as we sort of look at this, there might be something more. Let's sort of take a step back and think, well, what is a stakeholder and who is this community? This is a fancy slide you guys have all the great graphics, so I thought I'd include one of my own here. Yeah, so you can see that we think about it as layers. Right here would be your person living with HIV, but beyond that, there are other stakeholders that you need to engage. Friends and family, particularly, we've talked a little bit about treatment interruption. What would that mean for partners? We think about the ethics of potentially putting them at risk, but would they need to give consent? How would that affect trials moving forward? Media, in today's day and age, we saw some headlines, bee venom and soy sauce as potential cures, but those are things that happen. They are what's going on. I often talk about the taxi cab test. If you ever go to a foreign country and you get in and you talk about what you do, does the taxi cab know of that baby that was cured of HIV? So these things do get out, and they do have an effect in media perception, and so we need to think about what are our messages. One of the things I'll talk about in the next slide is women, and a lot of women consider their OBGYN to be their primary care provider. The OBGYN may not be following the latest and greatest of HIV cure strategies, and so they are somebody that we need to think about engaging. So we need to think about targeting physicians, nurses, the woman that sits at the front desk that comes into your trials. All of this has an impact on how we are thinking about our community. And then obviously these global stakeholders on the bottom, which seem obvious, but our funders, right? We have to think about when and where do we involve them, and especially when we think about regulatory issues and guidelines. So defining community, this is important. In CURE, the obvious go-to, right, is people living with HIV. But an individual's community membership is going to be fluid. They might be a person living with HIV, but they might also be a woman. They might also be somebody of color. So these are things to think about. They have multiple memberships. And when we're thinking about engaging community, we have to think about establishing a working definition. Who is it that we want to target? Who is it that we'd like to engage in these trials? And who is impacted by the research? The interesting thing about CURE is that these trials are beginning to move forward, and especially in cell and gene therapy, there's a history in cancer, but we're really at the forefront now of coming into these clinical trials and moving into humans now for HIV cure. But it's important to note here, this is from a 2013 report, so this data obviously is from 2011. And I just wanted to point out that this is across diseases, and it looks at different medical products that came out with multiple trials, multiple data, and it's important to note that HIV included women the least. And so this is probably, you can think about this in the prevention space for HIV, but just across the board. And so when we think about community, this is a really important one to think about. And this is from Rowena's paper, and she is up here in the corner, so you can go to her for questions as well. But I want to point out some of the differences. It breaks down CURE research here, and we can see that cell and gene therapy is at the lowest percent here of engaging. This is women. This is a kind of a small graphic, but this is females in trial here, and this is going to be non-whites in studies. And just to give a little context to what this is, it's actually, so the study includes 151 papers, 159 studies. For women in particular, the papers broke down women. It reported on 12,946 participants, or about 79% of the studies actually did sex differences. And of those, of about 13,000 participants, 2,323 were women, so about 18%. So we don't do a good enough job. And there is now a push to get women in, both from AMFAR and some studies that have been included in the NIH, and there are new regulatory rules. But some of the things I think is important to realize is that we often have said women of childbearing age can't be in studies because of dangers and toxicities. But a lot of the things we've talked about today have dangers and toxicities for men as well. And particularly we think about sterilizing and things that affect reproductive organs as well. So it is something to think about for men as well. And then also, non-white participants, we can see that it's still below 50%, really across the board in curative studies. So it is something we need to think about more. And as we think about engaging community, it's important to think about these populations in particular. So the what and why we're sort of doing this. And this is a bit of a how. There's a lot of different tools in the toolkit. I'm going to talk about good participatory practices. This came out of that PrEP trial that I mentioned earlier that was closed down in Cambodia and Cameroon. And the good participatory practices are a unique set of guidelines. They're a normative framework. There's 16 actual principles, 16 topic areas that move from formative research all the way through post-trial access to product. And I mean, everything in between, from informed consent to stakeholder education. And they really support the scientific aims. I think this is important to mention because good engagement doesn't mean increased enrollment. Increased enrollment is a sign of good engagement. And it's important to make that distinction. So the good participatory practices are really there, GPP, are really there to help support the scientific aims. It has been used quite a bit in the prevention space. You see it here in HIV trials. So it's also important to think about as you move through cure trials into phase 2 and phase 3 efficacy trials, this is the platform that people are using in countries. So it is something to think about now. It's also, it was reported in 2011 in the Presidential Commission on the Study of Bioethics. So this good participatory practices is the gold standard. AVAC now runs an online course as well, so people from Africa and other countries do sign up, and we do run this virtually. It's also been adapted into TB and neonatal research, so it does have, and more recently Ebola, so it does have applications outside of this field as well. And we talk about not just the CAB, and I think this is really important. So the things to think about are that there are more than just one definition of community, and we do have to define that up front in order to create a stakeholder engagement plan. But the other piece is to say that CABs are a vital piece, but they may not be enough. It's not always clear how a CAB is set up, if it's reflective of a community or a local population. I think that one of the things we can see is that some of the cities have not been, and are CABs reflecting what a local epidemic might be like. And so there was a community event last night that Michael Luella put on with Dr. Baltimore and Dr. Cannon, which was absolutely wonderful, that brings community together, and there are some great examples of that local event. There's also been things, you can take this with the Times, call-in radio shows, but you might think this right now would be a Twitter chat, which does happen. It happens, we do quite a few Blackgate Twitter chats after dark talking about these issues in HIV prevention space, and you could think about this also applying to cure as well. Also, like I said, good engagement it's not something that is used for recruitment, but it is obviously a sign of good engagement if it happens, and you do see these support groups and using and utilizing these other networks, and really doing the formative research up front, using all of these mechanisms that can happen. And the biggest thing I think to take away from all of these mechanisms is that they do build trust. As I mentioned, somebody who has an HIV positive diagnosis isn't just thinking about that. It comes in a whole context of their life. And this is just a comment from a U.S. advocate, and Matt Sharp helped develop these questions, and we did a few interviews with folks. And this actually came up, and I'm just going to read the highlighted piece, which just says that race matters, gender, sexual orientation, and age matter. And the same folks who are disproportionately affected by HIV now will be the ones who are neglected when a cure comes along. And if we are willing to discard Black gay men, sex workers, trans women now, we will surely forget about them even when we have new tools to fight the virus. So this is something really to think about. The fact that cure is new and exciting does not take away from the fact that it comes on the context of prevention and treatment and people who live in a world where all of this is happening. And when we think about wanting to scale these trials up, and even at this basic level, community input is so important now. And also community education, the only way to actually give input that is meaningful is to understand the science. So I do want to applaud the scientists today who took the time to create those community slides and really take down that summary, because those are so important when we think about empowering community. And just as that, I'll end, hopefully on time, with the conclusion that, a greater diversity of engagement mechanisms are needed to reach all communities. It's really important to recognize that community is a fluid concept, and the fact that this is really, once again, when we think about the prevention context in Thailand in particular, some days they did in their formative interviews, some days they would consider themselves to be trans women, and some days they would consider themselves to be MSM. So the idea of how you classify what you are is important. And also I would just add, just as we think about these communities too, that we do know that sex does play a role, and we can think about that in the context of some of John Carn's data on estrogen. So it is really a necessary thing to start thinking about these communities. And even at a basic research level, community can have an input both on spreading the word, getting endorsements, buying into the research, but also at this stage, building the trust. A lot of these procedures that you mentioned today about allogeneic stem cell transplants and conditioning do not seem easy, they do not seem fun, and they do not seem like something that somebody who doesn't understand the research may or may not want to participate in. So it's really important that we get messages out, get buy-in now, and start thinking about the whole community of people living with HIV and people who support that. So with that, I will take any questions.
Jessica, I had a question.
Yeah.
Actually, it's a comment for everyone really to consider. I love GTP coming from prevention. One of the interesting things that I've been learning, the enormous amount of funding and support that it takes to be able to do GPP and stakeholders doesn't exist on the treatment side. In fact, it seems to be shrinking and withering even further as treatment now is 1 pill a day. It seems like all of the funding that we have to help people who are positive get to these places where we expect negative people to be when it comes to HIV research. We're still relying on that engine of death to be our recruitment.
Yeah.
And I didn't know if you had any other experience with that, but really, I think the HIV stigma that we all grow up in and are stewed in really affects when we try to do GPP among positive people and among positive stakeholders, especially. We're not given the support that it takes. And if you think about it, since they are on a pill a day, they are just like the negative people. So we should have enormous wings of like how we have in the prevention service.
Yeah.
We have enormous amounts of education and training, and we don't have that on the treatment side. And I don't know if you know of any way we could fix that.
Yeah, I don't know if there's any way other than to say that it needs to be supported. I think it's a mind shift that people have to have. I do think that there has been a sense of people go after low-hanging fruit, and perhaps it's a bit provocative, but I will say it. It tends to be white, older MSM. And that isn't everybody, that isn't the entire population. And to get to those other people, you do have to go to OBGYN clinics, you do have to go into bars, you do have to do the work, and that does take funding. It's not impossible. There have been lots of trials. ECHO comes to mind. There's one, currently, and I'm sure Rowena knows a little bit more, so I just gave a quick glance at her. Monica Gandhi at UCSF is a huge supporter of this, but you're right, Michael, it does take funding and support, but I think we're there, and I think we have, and the fact that you all are here before cocktails and posters means that you all support and have this vision as well, so I really appreciate that. And there's a question in the back.
So what kind of barriers have you noticed when presenting this kind of communication in these scientific realms, and what are kind of like the implications or repercussions behind any barriers?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think that the biggest barrier is community literacy on the scientific side. I don't think that, I see that there is a lot of interest, but there's not necessarily the same, guidelines of how communities talk about that. I see that as a large barrier, and I do also see the people that do engagement are not necessarily the scientific researchers in the lab, and so there tends to be sometimes a disconnect between the people who are at the bench and the people who are down at leukapheresis donating cells, and it's important to make that connection. I don't know if I'm allowed to take more questions. It's really up to you.
You're doing okay. Maybe two more.
I'm Martha.
Hi, Jessica. I wanted to mention, though, that, and I think you almost addressed it with regards to the barrier, that it seems to me that also, the scientists and the scientific community needs to make, and you're right, I think the community summaries today were great, but I think there does need to be that extra effort to have a sort of translation of the work for the communities, and not a translation that sort of makes you look like you're dumb, because just because you're HIV positive doesn't mean your IQ goes down. We can understand if it's told to us in a way that we can understand it, and I just don't think that effort is made. And then the second thing I wanted to just comment on was the idea that when we're talking about women yesterday, that's a very sensitive subject for women. It's not just that they're excluded, but there's no consideration, and I think Paula alluded to it yesterday, where it's like, it's just easier to include men because they don't have children, they don't need this, and they don't need that. And I don't think that extra effort is made to do that. They're just going to say, well, it's just easier to do this. And I think going forward, people need to make that effort to women, not just to give the support that they need.
Yeah, I would just say that I forgot to mention one barrier, which is to say that it's something like this, an engagement platform like GPP or FHI 360, I don't think that those trainings get out to PIs or staff scientists as often as maybe they could. And so that's something that there may not be awareness of these broad engagement principles that are actually going on at the field level, so that also might be a disconnect. I'm not. Okay, I'll take it.
So, we're talking about the community as this monolithic, and we're talking about the scientists who clearly heard today that they're not a monolithic thought process from the scientific side. I know you're not implying that there's a monolithic thought process from the community or stakeholder side. So how do you deal with the heterogeneity in the community side, the stakeholder side, in terms of what people are expecting to engage with?
Yeah. So it's a great question. I think the biggest thing is to form a plan, and that's why I tried to say that you have to identify the community, just like your virus, but you have to know what you're working with in order to create a solution about that. So depending on the trial, you might think about those that both support or are against it. If we think about HIV in the context of prevention, which is just to say that those that are against homosexuality may or may not be against your trial, right? So those are people that you want to think about engaging with and then creating a plan based around them. Oftentimes, I think it could seem that you have to engage with everybody all the time, but there are different levels, and everything comes in phases within a trial. And so I think it's a great point to say that it is heterogeneous and it will change. So thank you.
Thank you. So we'll be sure to continue the conversation after we're done. So the final talk of the meeting is actually or the day. It represents a schedule change. Originally, Michelle Andrzejczyk was going to speak. Michelle had an unavoidable conflict with a nationwide rollout of an educational effort for HVTN. So she's actually, I think, on her way back from San Francisco right now. But sad as that is, that actually gives us a great opportunity. Gives us an opportunity to hear from Erick Seelbach. Many of you know Erick. Erick wears many hats, and one of the hats that Erick wears is as a very critical member of our community advisory board. So he's going to tell us about some of the things that have happened here in Seattle in regards to community and also nationwide.
Thank you. I'm really excited to be here. I want to start with commenting on a couple of the questions because they're just so present. One about the heterogeneity of community is that I am incredibly thankful for having had the opportunity to work with and in community in the realm of HIV because of the mind expansion that has happened for me, like the opening of my eyes, the sort of bursting of preconceptions, the knowledge that I've gained from the diversity of the communities that I've had the opportunity to work with has been incredible. So a lot of it is really about listening to who's in front of you and who's with you, and having that conversation built up from the ground of like what's going on with the people there. So I think that's an incredible point. The other about community literacy among scientists and the academy, I think one of the things we have to look at is how are young scientists educated about community, and how is community work included in their upbringing into the scientific world. And so I think there's a lot of work to be done there, but I'll carry on with what I'm supposed to talk about. I will probably reiterate many of the same points, which is that cure and cure research is happening in a bigger context, that HIV has been a context of prevention, treatment, addressing poverty. This quote for me speaks to the vulnerable populations, social determinants of health, poverty, stigma, discrimination, injustice, all of those things that are impacting people's ability to access services, people's ability to have healthy, whole lives. Those kinds of things impact them. This came from a guidance about prevention research, and one of the points that I will sort of continually drive home along with Jessica is that many of the things that we're hearing about prevention and its rollout, many of the things that we're hearing about treatment and its rollout also apply to how we go about rolling out cure and implementing cure when we have something that is viable beyond just Timothy. So, you know, we have a great opportunity now in that we're still early enough in the work in cure that we can start thinking about those things so that we're not faced with as many of the questions that some of those other things have been faced with. There are models out there about ways to engage community. One, there's a whole set of research practices called community-based participatory research, which is about sort of co-orienting research with the community around social justice issues. It's built on the strength and resiliency of communities and identifying the context in which community exists and the questions that community has. It's building partnerships. It's including community in planning. It's sort of building a research base and a practice that is in partnership with and by community along with the researchers. And that goes from prior to identifying questions to after the research has been disseminated. How do we make sure that the knowledge that we've gained from doing research in community is put back into the community so that they know what's been happening? It's really about sort of exploring cultural humility instead of just having cultural competency. So it's sort of building on those. That frequently, though, with community-based participatory research, we find that researchers will come to a community after an idea has been formed and say, let's build a community-based practice around this question that we have because we need you to build the question. That's almost too late at that point because the questions also come from community. Community has questions about this stuff that also could be answered. And so building a partnership where community has questions, scientists have expertise in figuring out how to answer questions, how do we do that together? So a community-based approach about acting together, really about mobilizing folks in community. It's really about for, by, and with, and not just for. So it's, you know, sort of expanding the notion. It's really about how do we sort of flip power and hierarchical bases, because there is really a very visible and clear power structure in the way most research is done. The hierarchy of, you know, there's community, there's research, there's the academy, and who sits where on that power structure. And so community-based approaches can flip those around. There's a lot of knowledge in community that is not necessarily considered expert and that can be mobilized to figure out ways to answer these questions that we have and really empower sort of the communities that we're working with to engage in their health and wellness as well. And having a social justice approach really is about empowering people. It's about empowering communities to take ownership of their health. And it's about social transformation. Jessica pointed to one of these tools. There are many tools available, many guidance documents out there. Here's just 3 of them. One, recommendations for community engagement in HIV research, good participatory practice, stakeholder engagement toolkits. These have been worked on for many years. There's decades of experience in community and stakeholder engagement in the HIV world that we in Cure can build on. Many of us who are involved from the community side in Cure research have also been involved in all of those movements as well. And so capitalizing on the work that's already been done rather than starting to reinvent a wheel, we can take that and carry it forward in the world of Cure research. So the words in boxes there are sort of key principles that will come up in many of these documents. To point to a local example, here's some pictures from the Defeat HIV Community Advisory Board, many of whom are in the room right now. Raise your hands. Defeat HIV Community Advisory Board, and we have members of the community advisory boards from the other collaboratories. You can also raise your hands because we're happy to have you here. So it's interspersed throughout. Our local community advisory board has been very, very active in engaging community in different ways. We had an event last night. That's one of many that we've had. Here's some pictures. I want to point out the numbers here. 55,507 what we call engagements with HIV Cure research. That includes both sort of physical live body presence at an event. So people who came to an event like last night's event would be counted as quote unquote live engagements. And then we have our whole online presence that includes Facebook and Twitter and YouTube and all of those. Then the reach of those gets extended and extended and extended. And so that's a lot of work and a lot of people who are being engaged in what Cure research is and what it means in the world and how you all are doing the research about it and the science so that we can understand and the community can understand what's happening. If you want to know more about those numbers and what's behind them, come to the poster session. The Defeat HIV Community Advisory Board has a poster in the poster session, so you can learn more about that. I also want to point out on a practical note, for those of you who might be applying for the Martin Delaney Collaboratory Cure Research RFA, if you're working on it, there is a section in that about community engagement that is pretty specific about including your plan. So for the practical people, it's also a funding requirement. Not that that's why you should do it, but just to note that that's there as well. Right? Extra motivation. So, and I also want to point out that, you know, community, for those of us who have been engaged, we're very willing to have conversations about what this can look like as you're applying for those kinds of things. I want to point out that up at IAS in Vancouver, one of the things that I kept hearing about over and over and over the whole time that I was there was that we really need to be doing more with implementation science. We really need to be thinking more about how social determinants are getting in the way of people's ability to access prevention, how those kinds of things are getting in the way of people's ability to access treatment and care, how we have the tools we need, the knowledge we need to end the epidemic, minus cure, but in the context of prevention and treatment, we have the tools, and there's lots of things that are getting in the way of rolling those out and people's ability to access those and connect with them. And I kept thinking, you know, we don't really include cure in those conversations, and we should. Because the reality is, when we have a cure that is feasibly implementable, we're going to have all these barriers. They're going to apply to cure also. And so we can take the work that's being done in this realm, prevention and treatment, and apply it so that we do the advanced thinking. And I know a lot of times people think about, well, I just do basic lab science, and so that's for somebody else. That's for the social sciences to think about. That's for other people later on down the line. And what I would say is you have just as much a role in implementation as anybody else, which is helping advance the knowledge base of community to understand the science of what you're doing and how that works. And so building partnerships with community to help that knowledge ripple out so that we're not getting things like, well, beeswax will cure it, or, you know, those kinds of things that you pointed out this morning. We can do some advanced prep so that when we have a cure, we'll have a much better chance of rolling it out. So I just wanted to throw those up because they were fresh on my mind from IAS very recently. And so to sort of summarize the points that I've been trying to make is that there is a history relating to the HIV response that is an activist history on the community side, and that has to be taken into consideration. There are decades of community engagement experience in the field, like I talked about. There's a diversity of communities. Many of those communities who are impacted are marginalized communities, and so there's extra layers of work to do around empowerment and social justice. There's things to consider about long-term survivors and their role in this research, newly infected people and their role, what the ethics of these trials are going to be as we move from more of the lab side of things to more of the bigger clinical trials. We've got lots to think about and work through before then. So we are at the perfect opportunity right now to begin to address the implications of cure. There's lots of them. When I was a young gay boy coming out, we weren't allowed to think about cure. That was not a word we could think about. And so for me to stand next to Timothy Ray Brown and say, this man has been cured, that's a huge paradigm shift for me and the community, right? And so the implications of that are huge, and we need to consider those, along with the regulatory and public health and social and cultural implications as well. And again, now to lay the groundwork to ensure a successful transition from the lab to the clinical trials, and from there to implementation when we're ready for that. Here's some references, and then acknowledgements. The folks at defeatHIV Collaboratory have been swell, and then all the members of the defeatHIV Community Advisory Board. Thank you. Yes.
Yeah, there's been a lot of talk about community, the HIV positive people, but I actually kind of want to bring it back to the scientific community. You and Jessica both highlighted the potential role of, a lot of the people even in this room, like basic scientists, like you say, they might feel that they're a long way removed. But actually, I think there's a larger role beyond education that they could play, and that is, I think in my experience, scientists across the board really make the assumption that biologically all people are gay white men, and whatever you find in gay white men is going to be applicable to everybody.
Right.
And so I'm from AMFAR, I represent a funder, and we were interested in funding a project to build a sex differences in a pure environment. And I was shocked at how resistant researchers were to even start looking at it. We wanted to give them money, and still they didn't want to look at it. And yet now, John Carnes last month presented the first data where the presence of estrogen, he's demonstrated that the presence of estrogen actually makes it harder to reactivate latently infected cells. So now people are interested. And I think if there were an opportunity to get people interested from a biological perspective, there's lots of reasons to believe that there should be testing the immune system differences between men and women. But I think actually that's kind of probably a way to get basic scientists interested. So for those of you who work in the lab with primary cells, like if you're trying to knock down or out CCR5 or knock in other genes, and you're looking to see how long are they going to persist, whether that be culture or in vivo. Like, have you thought about, take some cells from females versus males, because people are different. Take some cells from older people with HIV and younger people from HIV, see if they're different. I mean, there's a role to play there. I think you can get people interested in biology. For people who are biology scientists, that's what we get into that.
Sure. Thank you.
I would also just add that there's product development that could be done at a basic research level. Granted, it's not my area of expertise, but I think back to glycerin in the rectal microbicides and the level of glycerin. If somebody had done these formative research consultations in the beginning, perhaps we could think about having a low level of glycerin in your product versus a high level of glycerin, and just what people prefer. So even at this basic level, as we begin to think about product and study design, it's a good place to get those people interested and to get feedback on what may or may not be something that people are willing to do.
Yes.
I just echo what this lady said. As I was listening to both presentations, I thought about where researchers are today, and I've heard some references that echo, that a researcher doesn't see community, they only see themselves. And if they don't see the community, then they don't see a need to include community. And how do you overcome that barrier? But my main comment I wanted to make was I really appreciate adding community to the conference. And I think it would have been, I think, the most effective conferences are those that include having a presenter that's HIV positive and constantly showing the researchers this is who you're working for.
Well, I think you make a great point, which is that we as community show up at places and keep asking questions and keep talking about the stories behind the people. You know, my day job, I work for government, and so we talk about public health and population level and numbers, and I frequently remind people that behind the numbers, behind the number of folks living with the disease or impacted by or at risk for, there's real people. And some of them are in this room. You know, I get to sit in lots of rooms with researchers talking about all of the issues, and I sit there as a queer person on PrEP and listen to the way folks talk about us without realizing that we're there in the room listening, right? And so just remember, we're there, whether you think we are or not, we're there and paying attention. Yes?
Yes. One other comment that I would make is to also think about the aspect of the community that is also looking at the degree of interaction. You could have a group such as this one that is heavily science-oriented, that we want access to the protocol, to read them ahead of time, and be able to influence that.
Mm-hmm.
And oftentimes there can be collisions with expectations.
Mm-hmm.
So to think about those things ahead of time before you actually involve the community might also be helpful.
Right. Particularly as we begin to move towards larger clinical trials, the understanding of what people can deal with or go through as participants in a trial is, you know, that we're here to help talk about that and work through that and have conversations about it. You had a question, sir.
I just wanted to make a point, sort of this, if I had a message of the scientists to the community and related to a cure, it would be that the degree to which you suppress your viral, I'm sure you get this message out, but the degree to which you suppress your viral load is the likelihood that you will be cured. The degree to which you suppress your viral load now is the likelihood that you will be cured later. I think most scientists in this room would agree with that if we're going to cure anybody at all, it's going to be individuals who have done a terrific job suppressing the viral load. And that's why it's likely that more marginalized and economically disadvantaged groups will not be cured as effectively as those who are not.
I think that's the first time I've heard that said so succinctly. So it's a great message to think about. How are we on? I see.
Let's do two more, and then we'll move along.
Okay.
Yeah, I was just going to piggyback on what you were saying. I found it really interesting. When I was in Vancouver, I'm new to the DARE cast, so I'm sort of wrapping my head around here. I come from the treatment side. And we were engaging, and I said that I view CABs as bidirectional, that I bring information, I take information back. And one of the scientists looked at me and said, what information would you carry back? And that was exactly the message I carry back from Vancouver. And I have 8 physicians that work in a private practice, and 2 of them are not treating all of their patients because they think it's, their choice, or this person's a long-term non-progressor, they don't need it. And, I hit them with community viral load, I hit them with all of these arguments. But when I came back from Vancouver, which I only got to attend as a member
of this cab and carry that information back. All 8 of our physicians are now prescribing, and we now have plans in place to get every single patient, regardless of whether they're a long-term non-progressor or lead control or on med. And so I think that's the disconnect. I mean, providers treating this disease don't even know the things that are being presented here by the researchers. And I think that bridge has to be built, because that is a really salient argument for us on the street, for someone who says, why should I take this medication? It's like, well, let me tell you why. Because if the cure is going to come down right now, it's going to come down for people who are on this medication because they've controlled the virus. So I applaud you for saying that, and I think we need more messages like that we can take back to the community and really show people what not only their tax dollars are paying for, but that there is some progress here, because I think that's the hope that has kept people alive and will keep people alive until we have the moment that we can cure them.
Yes, thank you. Lori?
So I think that there are a number of things that can be done together. So messages like that, if we have scientists standing up and saying that to regulatory bodies and funding bodies, that's how we can begin to change the standard of care, so that in places like sub-Saharan Africa, where most of the HIV infection actually is, how do we change the standard of care so everybody is infected with sub-Saharan Africa with the same access to treatment that we have here in Seattle? And it's when the scientists and the clinicians and the community members, are speaking with a single voice and have a political will to create, to shift the resources. That's how we go about creating the change, so that everybody can be creating, the best viral suppression possible, so that when we have a cure, people are better positioned. And I love that people today were talking about, we've got this thing that right now, cell and gene therapy is not going to be immediately affordable and accessible, but we can be thinking about, all right, how do we create this in a stable way that doesn't require the technology that we have? And so having that partnership is a way of building trust. I think it's breaking down silos. You don't have a clinical track and a pre-science track and a social science track. It all needs to be integrated, because each one has to inform the other. And right now, before we're in a lot of clinical trials, it's a good time to be doing the social science acceptability work and building the community understanding, and we can be doing that right now, so that we know, well, what is acceptable and not acceptable to people who are going to want to enroll, and what are the misconceptions we need to clear up, and what are the ethical issues we need to struggle with together, so that we'll be able to, accrue people quickly when it's time to have a trial, and we have a trial that's acceptable to the people who are going to need to be in it. So I think that there's a lot we can do in partnership right now with each other.
Yep. Thank you.
Thanks. Thank you, Erick. Thank you, Erick, and thank you, Lori, for the last word. That's outstanding. But the conversation doesn't need to end. Both community and the science we've heard today has been fantastic. And we're just going to continue right down the hall in the Z conference room, SCE. You'll follow us all down here. There's posters, there's hors d'oeuvres, and there's some beer and wine. So join us, and we'll go from there to dinner.